It begins in the most familiar way possible. No thunder in the sky, no formal declaration, no dramatic breaking news banner that screams history is about to change. Just a sequence of headlines scrolling by, the kind most people barely register before moving on. A tanker is seized, a phone call is made, a warning is issued. Another statement follows, translated, summarized, softened, or sharpened, depending on who is telling the story. If you weren't paying attention, you could easily assume this was just another episode in the long-running series of global politics dense, noisy, but ultimately routine. And yet, history rarely announces itself when it matters most. The United States is once again looking south, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last. For more than 200 years, the Western Hemisphere has been treated as a familiar sphere of influence, a region where pressure could be applied with relative confidence and predictable results. On the surface, what's happening now fits neatly into that tradition. Pressure increases, naval assets appear offshore, drug routes are targeted, sanctions tighten. A Venezuelan oil ship is seasoned with gunfire, but with paperwork, legal authority, and the quiet force of economic power. From Caracas, the response follows an equally predictable script: strong words, nationalist rhetoric, promises of resistance, speeches framed around sovereignty and survival, threats aimed northward, delivered with enough theatrical force to reassure supporters at home. Anyone who has watched international politics for long enough has seen this exchange play out countless times. One side applies leverage, the other pushes back. Commentators argue, social media erupts, then the cycle resets. Nothing about this feels new. And then there is that small detail, almost a joke, slipped into the narrative without ceremony. A remark about oil, a casual assumption that the resource itself is the prize, that holding it is not controversial but obvious. It's not a call to arms. It's not framed as ideology. It's said almost offhandedly with a trace of humor. Yet it echoes something ancient and uncomfortable. The idea that beneath many modern conflicts lies the same old question: who controls the fuel that keeps the world moving? At this point, most people stop thinking. They file Venezuela into a mental category they already understand. A troubled country, a collapsed economy, a defiant leadership clinging to power. A resource-rich state caught in the machinery of sanctions and geopolitics. In this version of the story, nothing truly extraordinary is happening. It's all logical, it all fits. But the most dangerous moments in history are often the ones that make perfect sense. Pause for a moment and look beyond the headlines. Not at what is happening, but at how casually it is being discussed. A seized tanker is treated as a procedural matter. Military movement is framed as deterrence. Escalating rhetoric is brushed aside as posturing. Each individual event feels small enough to ignore, reasonable, even, and yet, history does not move in isolated events, moves in chains. One reaction pulls another. One assumption invites a response. One miscalculation compounds quietly. Think about how rarely global upheavals begin with clarity. Wars do not start because everyone agrees they are necessary. They begin because someone assumes the other side will blink. Because a decision is made under the belief that consequences will be limited. Because a situation is reduced to a single variable: oil power. Pride and everything else is treated as noise. Venezuela, in this moment, is being simplified, reduced, talked about as though it exists in isolation. As though it is merely a local problem, a manageable irritation, a country that can be pressured without reverberations. That assumption is comforting. It allows observers to remain detached. It creates the illusion that events here are contained. But containment is rarely real. Beneath the surface of this crisis is a far more complicated reality. Venezuela is not just a struggling nation with oil reserves. It is a nodal place where interests intersect quietly but decisively. Financial ties, strategic partnerships, long-term investments that do not disappear just because headlines shift. The same global players whose names dominate discussions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East have footprints here too, even if they are less visible. When multiple powers invest in the same pressure point, that point becomes sensitive in ways that are easy to underestimate. What stands out most is not the aggression, but the indifference. The way the situation is discussed with a shrug. The rhetorical question, who cares? The ease with which a nation can be dismissed as irrelevant. That is often the moment when history starts paying attention. Because when decision makers believe a place doesn't matter, they tend to act more freely. And freedom, in geopolitics, can be dangerous. So far, nothing looks like a turning point. There are no missiles in the air, no emergency summits, no formal alliances being triggered. But there is a subtle shift in tone, a sense that old assumptions are being tested, that familiar rules may no longer apply as neatly as they once did. And it is precisely here, before anything dramatic happens, that the story takes an unexpected turn. Amid the political analysis and military speculation, a phrase from the past resurfaces, not from a strategist or an intelligence report, but from a voice most people would dismiss outright. A sentence that does not mention oil, sanctions, or power. A sentence without dates or details. Just a quiet, unsettling suggestion. It will begin here. At this stage, belief is not required. Skepticism is welcome. In fact, skepticism is expected. What matters is not whether the statement is true, but why it feels uncomfortable when placed next to current events, why it lingers longer than it should, why it introduces doubt into a narrative that otherwise feels too neat, too controlled. History rarely begins with a roar. More often, it begins with a whisper easy to ignore, easy to mock, easy to forget, until suddenly it isn't. And Venezuela, whether we like it or not, is standing exactly where whispers tend to start. The moment the conversation shifts away from ships, sanctions, and speeches, it feels almost inappropriate, as if we're stepping off a well-lit road and onto uneven ground. This is usually where people grow uneasy. Politics is safe territory. History feels solid. But the moment a story introduces something less tangible, visions, intuition, prophecy, the instinctive reaction is to pull back. So bear with me. Let's say you don't believe in mystics. Let's say you're not religious. Let's say the very idea of prophecy makes you uncomfortable, or even irritated. That's fine. You don't need belief to follow this part of the story. All that's required is attention. Because the figure at the center of this shift is not famous. She is not quoted in textbooks. She doesn't appear in intelligence briefings or diplomatic cables. And yet, her words have resurfaced at moments when history seemed to wobble. Her name was Maria Esperanza de Bianchini. She was Venezuelan, a wife, a mother, a woman who lived most of her life outside the spotlight. Within Catholic circles, she became known not for political commentary, but for mystical experiences, visions associated with the Virgin Mary, moments of prayer that witnesses claimed were accompanied by unusual phenomena. To outsiders, this already sounds like a reason to stop listening. To believers, it was something else entirely. What matters here is not whether her experiences were real. What matters is that long before Venezuela became a recurring headline, her name was already associated with something unsettling: foresight, Years before September 11th, 2001, Maria Esperanza reportedly spoke of seeing two tall buildings, smoke pouring out, chaos spreading through a city, not once, but on multiple occasions. According to accounts, she mentioned this vision as early as the early 1990s, before the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, before the attacks that would permanently reshape the global order. Then again, around the year 2000, and again, just weeks before the attacks themselves. Coincidence, skeptics would say. Retrofitting meaning after the fact. Selective memory. All reasonable objections. And yet, even among hardened realists, there's an uncomfortable pause when a pattern appears too specific to dismiss casually. Still, even that is not the heart of the matter. What draws attention now is a much shorter statement, a line that lacks drama. No dates, no images of destruction, no explicit warnings. Just a remark attributed to her while discussing global calamities events with consequences far beyond borders. It will begin here. Here, meaning Venezuela, not a war, not an invasion, not a revolution. Just it, undefined, open-ended, almost frustratingly vague. The kind of phrase that can be ignored for decades because it refuses to explain itself. And that is precisely why it lingers. If Maria Esperanza had said World War III will start in Venezuela, the statement would be easy to discard. History is littered with failed doomsday predictions. Specificity is often prophecy's downfall. But this wasn't specific. It was ambiguous enough to survive time, ambiguous enough to adapt, ambiguous enough to be forgotten till circumstances change. Within the Catholic tradition, this kind of statement occupies a strange space. It falls under what is known as private revelation. Catholics are not required to believe it. The Church itself treats such claims cautiously, emphasizing discernment rather than acceptance. Even if a person is eventually recognized as a saint, their visions are not elevated to doctrine. Faith does not depend on them. That distinction matters, because it allows the conversation to stay grounded. This is not about theology overriding reason. It's about why certain words, spoken decades ago, feel heavier when placed next to current events. Ask yourself this: why does this particular phrase resurface now? It's not because Venezuela is suddenly more religious. It's not because mysticism has gained credibility in policy circles. It's because the geopolitical environment has shifted in a way that makes open-ended warnings feel less absurd. When tensions rise across multiple regions simultaneously, when alliances harden, when conflicts begin to mirror one another in structure, if not in location, people start looking backward as much as forward. They start asking whether history leaves echoes before it repeats itself. The power of Maria Esperanza's statement is not predictive precision. It's narrative placement. Venezuela was not a global focal point when she said those words. It was not at the center of any looming world crisis. There was no obvious reason to single it out, which makes the choice unsettling in hindsight. But hindsight is dangerous too. The temptation is to read destiny into randomness, to connect dots that were never meant to align. That's why skepticism is essential here. Blind belief is not incited surrender, and this story is not asking for surrender, it's asking for restraint. Because whether you view Maria Esperanza as a mystic, a symbol, or simply a footnote, her words introduce a crack in the certainty of the present narrative. They challenge the assumption that we fully understand where global shifts originate. They whisper that beginnings are often invisible at the time, and that is the unsettling part. Not that a woman may have seen something coming, but that history has a habit of starting quietly in places no one is watching closely anymore. In countries written off as already broken, in regions assumed to be predictable. At this stage, nothing has been fulfilled. Nothing has been proven. There is only a convergence modern tension brushing up against an old, unresolved sentence. A sentence that refuses to explain itself, even now. And that forces a different kind of question. Not, is the prophecy real? But what if dismissing it is the real mistake? Because history doesn't require belief to unfold. It only requires momentum. History has a habit of humiliating certainty. It waits patiently for humans to declare that something is impossible, improbable, or insignificant. Then it unfolds anyway. Not with spectacle, but with irony. With timing that feels almost deliberate. And most often, with beginnings so small they barely register until it's too late to isolate them. This is where perspective matters. When people imagine the origins of global upheaval, they tend to picture dramatic openings, armies mobilizing, treaties collapsing, explosions that redraw borders overnight. But that's rarely how it works. More often, the beginning looks like a footnote, a local incident, a misjudgment no one believes will matter beyond its immediate context. Consider Europe in 1914. The world at that time was deeply interconnected, economically, politically, culturally. Trade networks stretched across continents. Royal families were interlinked by blood. There were tensions, yes, but also assumptions. Assumptions that diplomacy would prevail, that any crisis would be contained, that the system, though strained, was stable enough to absorb shocks. Then an archduke was assassinated. Not a king, not a head of government steering global policy, an heir visiting a region already dismissed as volatile and peripheral. The assassination itself was messy, almost accidental in its execution. A wrong turn, a chance encounter, a single gunshot that should have remained a regional tragedy. It didn't. Within weeks, alliances activated like dominoes. Mobilizations triggered counter-mobilizations. What began as a localized political murder escalated into a war that consumed empires, redrew maps, and permanently altered the structure of global power. And even that wasn't the end. The consequences of that one moment rippled forward into another world war, and then into a decades-long Cold War that defined the modern era. No one in Sarajevo believed they were standing at the mouth of the 20th century defining catastrophe. That's the lesson most people misunderstand. History does not announce its intentions at the beginning. It only reveals them later, when patterns become obvious and causality feels inevitable. At the time, events are fragmented, confusing, easily dismissed. Now return to the present. Venezuela is not Sarajevo. The analogy is not literal, but the structure of the situation feels familiar in a way that should unsettle anyone paying attention. A country widely dismissed as unstable, marginal, already lost. A place written off as a cautionary tale rather than a strategic pivot. And yet, beneath that dismissal lies complexity that doesn't fit the narrative. This is not just about internal collapse or authoritarian governance. It's about convergence. Multiple global powers have stakes here, not symbolic ones, material ones. Energy investments, strategic positioning, long-term influence in a hemisphere historically dominated by one power that is now being quietly challenged. These interests do not exist in isolation. They interact, they compete, and in moments of pressure, they collide. That collision doesn't require intention to become dangerous. Look at the broader global landscape. Conflicts erupting in parallel. Tensions escalating in regions that were once considered frozen or resolved. Diplomatic language hardening. Military budgets swelling. Each crisis explained on its own terms. Each framed as manageable. each treated as separate. But history rarely respects compartmentalization. What links these moments is not ideology or geography's momentum, a world adjusting to shifting power balances, a system recalibrating under strain. In such moments, flashpoints matter less for what they are than for when they appear. Venezuela is appearing at the wrong time. That doesn't mean war is inevitable. It doesn't mean prophecy is being fulfilled. But it does mean that dismissiveness is dangerous. Because when decision makers believe a situation is contained, they tend to take risks they wouldn't take elsewhere. They assume reactions will be limited, that escalation will be controlled, that the rules still apply. Those assumptions are exactly what history punishes. Think about how often hindsight rewrites beginnings, how events that once felt trivial later become obvious precursors, trade disputes that morph into sanctions, sanctions that harden into blockades, blockades that provoke retaliation, retaliation that invites intervention, each step justified, each step explained, each step seemingly rational, until the chain becomes irreversible. This is why the comparison to earlier historical turning points matters, not because the details match, but because the pattern does. The underestimation, the confidence, the belief that this is different or this won't spread. And this is where the earlier whisper returns, uninvited. It will begin here, not as a prediction carved in stone, but as a reminder of how beginnings work. Not loud, not obvious, not universally acknowledged, but present nonetheless, embedded in circumstances that feel ordinary to those living through them. The danger is not believing too much in such statements. The danger is believing too much in our own certainty that we've seen this movie before and know how it ends. Because history's most devastating chapters often begin when everyone thinks they already understand the script. At this stage, nothing has crossed a threshold. There is no point of no return. But there is a familiar alignment pressure, pride, competing interests, and a shared belief that escalation can be managed. That belief has failed before. The question, then, is not whether Venezuela is destined to ignite something larger. Destiny is a poor analytical tool. The real question is whether the conditions that allow small events to spiral are quietly assembling, and whether we are too focused on the surface to notice. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. And the rhyme is never obvious until the verse is nearly finished. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all, that by the time beginnings are recognized as such, they are usually no longer beginnings. They are momentum. From a distance, Venezuela is easy to explain. Too easy. Oil, sanctions, an isolated government, a population under pressure. The story fits neatly into familiar categories, and familiar categories are comforting because they suggest predictability. They imply that outcomes can be managed, reactions anticipated, consequences limited. But distance, up close, Venezuela is not a single problem, it's an intersection. And intersections are where accidents happen. Not because anyone intends them to, but because too many trajectories cross the same space at the same time. Strip away the rhetoric and you begin to see something else taking shape. Venezuela is not just struggling internally, it is embedded externally. Its oil is not merely a commodity, it's collateral. Its ports are not just logistical points, they are strategic footholds. Its financial ties stretch far beyond its borders, binding it quietly to powers that do not share the same interests, timelines, or risk tolerance. This is where the narrative changes. The situation is often framed as a standoff between one dominant power and one defiant state. That framing is incomplete. Beneath it lies a more complicated geometry. investments that cannot simply be written off, alliances that are unofficial but consequential, partnerships formed not out of ideology, but out of opportunity, out of a shared desire to counterbalance influence. And when influence is challenged, responses tend to escalate in subtle ways first. No flags are raised, no treaties announced. Instead, leverage is applied indirectly. Financial pressure here, strategic cooperation there, quiet assurances given behind closed doors. None of this looks dramatic on its own, but together they form a web tightening, slowly, almost invisibly. This is what makes Venezuela dangerous in a way that raw power calculations often miss. It is not strong enough to dominate, not weak enough to be ignored, and too entangled to be isolated without consequence. History is filled with examples of places like this, regions that mattered less for what they were and more for who was invested in them. They become testing grounds, signals, messages sent without being explicitly addressed. Actions taken just enough to provoke a response, but not enough to justify outright confrontation, until someone misreads the signal. That misreading is always the risk. One side assumes restraint where there is pride, another assumes indifference where there is long-term planning. Decisions are made based on incomplete pictures, filtered through assumptions inherited from an earlier era, and Venezuela sits at the center of that mismatch. For some, it is a problem to be solved. For others, it is leverage to be preserved. For others still, it is an opportunity and opening in a hemisphere once considered closed. Each perspective is rational on its own. Together, they are combustible. This is why the focus on oil alone is misleading. Oil is visible. Oil is measurable. Oil can be priced, sanctioned, seized. But influence is harder to quantify. So is prestige. So is the cost of backing down in a world where perception often matters as much as outcome. When multiple powers attach their credibility to the same place, that place becomes fragile. And fragility is not about weakness, it's about sensitivity. This is the layer most people never see because it doesn't announce itself. It exists beneath speeches and sanctions, beneath headlines and social media outrage. It operates in quiet recalculations, in strategic patience, in the assumption that no one else will push too far. Those assumptions tend to hold until they don't. At moments like this, escalation doesn't require aggression. It only requires misalignment. One actor moves slightly faster than expected. Another interprets caution as opportunity. A third believes its interests are being sidelined and decides to assert them. None of these steps are irrational. None of them are unprecedented. But together, they altered the equation. This is why comparisons to other global flashpoints keep surfacing. Not because the situations are identical, but because the structure is. Multiple actors, overlapping interests, a shared belief that escalation can be controlled, and a growing sense that time favors action rather than restraint. In that environment, the margin for error narrows. And this is where the prophetic language, whether you take it seriously or not, finds its relevance. Not as a forecast, but as a metaphor. It will begin here does not need to mean explosions or invasions. Beginnings can be administrative, financial, symbolic. They can start with seizures instead of shells, with pressure instead of fire. By the time violence appears, the beginning is already long past. What makes Venezuela unsettling is not that it is powerful, but that it is positioned. Positioned at a moment when global patience is thinning, when old balances are shifting, when multiple powers are probing the limits of influence without fully understanding where those limits now lie. At intersections like this, history does not require intention, it only requires proximity. and Venezuela has too much of it. So where does that leave us? Not at the edge of certainty, not at the threshold of belief, and certainly not at a conclusion that demands faith in prophecy or fear of inevitability. What it leaves us with is something far quieter and far more difficult to sit with. Restraint. It's tempting, when faced with language like prophecy, to rush toward extremes, to either embrace it as hidden truth or dismiss it as superstition. Both reactions are easy. Both are comforting in their own way. Belief gives meaning. Dismissal gives control. What neither provides is clarity, and clarity is what this moment quietly demands. The Venezuelan prophecy, if it can even be called that, does not function like a prediction. It offers no timeline, no mechanism, no instructions. It does not tell us what will happen, only where something might begin. Its power, if it has any at all, lies not in certainty, but in discomfort, in its refusal to resolve neatly. That discomfort is useful, because it pushes against a far more dangerous assumption that we already understand how history unfolds, that we can identify beginnings in real time, that we can safely label certain regions as peripheral, certain crises as contained, certain pressures as manageable. History has punished those assumptions repeatedly. Taking this prophecy seriously does not mean believing it is true. It means resisting the urge to laugh it off simply because it does not fit our preferred frameworks. It means acknowledging that warnings do not always arrive dressed as data. Sometimes they arrive as unease, as questions that refuse to go away. And perhaps that is the real function of prophetic language in a modern world. Not to predict outcomes, but to interrupt complacency. Because nothing in Venezuela today guarantees catastrophe. There is no script demanding escalation. There is still room for de-escalation, for missteps to be corrected, for pressures to ease rather than compound. History is not fate. It is choice layered upon choice. But those choices are made by people who believe they are in control. The danger is not that a prophecy might be fulfilled. The danger is that confidence blinds us to how fragile moments like this actually are. So maybe the most responsible response is neither belief nor disbelief, but attention. Attention to tone, to timing, to intersections that feel too crowded, too sensitive, to casually dismissed. And if history does begin, here if not in fire, then in motion, it will not ask whether we believed in it beforehand. It never does. The story fades, not with a warning, but with a pause, with the recognition that some beginnings only become visible when we slow down enough to notice them. And that, perhaps, is the quiet challenge left behind. Not to fear prophecy, but to fear indifference.